Let's bring in David Stockman, former economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan. There's no urgency, though. And if we don't do something about our annual budget deficits and our longer-term debt that we're accumulating, is it just going to be kind of a slow drip, like where we bleed to death as a nation, where we don't really feel it until it's too late?
No, I think you drift along until you reach an inflection point, and then it flares up in a uncontrollable, disastrous way. So that's why I say this is a good idea, this bill, but they should be sending it to Bernanke, too, and his merry band of lunatic money printers, because I believe ultimately they are the number 1, 2, and 3 cause of this huge fiscal stalemate and this disastrous budget drift that we're in. When you tell the Congress, as the market is saying this morning, which is totally medicated by the Fed, right, you can borrow 90-day money for 7 basis points, which is a rounding error, you can't even see it, or 3 years for 40 basis points. There's no urgency. They will never fall on the sword. They will never make any hard choices. And they'll never level and be honest with the public that we need both huge spending cuts as well as more revenue to get this deficit under control. Number 2, you don't have 10 years. If you take an outlook for the next 10 years identical to the last 10, in other words, an on-rosy scenario, right, what really happened, which wasn't very good, we're facing 15 trillion or more additional deficits, a built-in national debt that would be 30 trillion, 150% of GDP. That's where we're drifting. And this says, but balance it in 10 years. You don't have 10 years. They need to get to it right now, this year, next year, but with major cuts.
Argument, and you're right, about being forced to do it, and the reason that there's no urgency is because rates are so low. When do you see that changing? Because I think, as you said at the outset of your remarks, it's not a problem until it's a problem. But nobody can predict when that,
Well, that's exactly right. Greece thought it wasn't a problem until all of a sudden they couldn't borrow. The market closed. Now, just because we issue our own money, it doesn't mean that we can flood the world with 100 trillion worth of dollar liabilities over time. There are limits to all of this, and I think the markets are beginning to get nervous already about how far the Fed can go in this money printing. What they're doing right now, $85 billion a month, they're buying either of mortgage-backed securities or treasury bonds. That is totally artificially suppressing the market. And I believe at some point they're going to be forced to stop.
But on the flip side, you have plenty of Democrats who, not on camera, talk about this debt's not a worry. We're not concerned with it. An article in the LA Times last week said our biggest economic concern is not the debt and the deficit. And then you have people pointing to that weak economic growth during the fourth quarter where we went negative. And again, it was because of government spending cuts. And no politician is going to let that happen, even if you're on a Republican.
Well, that may be true, but the only reason we have even a semblance of recovery over the last 3 or 4 years is that we've borrowed 4 or 5 trillion, laid the tab on the next generation, our children and the children to come, and it has been totally artificial. Now, at some point, we're going to have to begin reducing the deficit. When we do, the economy will be weak. That will make the deficit challenge even greater. It's a negative feedback loop. Right now, when all these Democrats say, look, at the market, Mr. Market is saying, go ahead, borrow. We don't care. That is not a real market. That is the Federal Reserve. That's the Eccles building. That's one side of Washington telling the other side, don't worry, I'm buying all the bonds. Now, if you think this kind of Ponzi finance is anything to do with capitalism or free markets or anything to do with sustainability, then you've read an economic textbook that didn't even exist in 1995.
David, thank you so much, David Stockman. I know it's like facelifts, like the first few you get, it's kind of hides your age, but eventually you're going to look, well, 86.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but
I'm serious. You can only cover it up for so
David.
long. And then, thanks, David. What?